You don't belong here. The words were quiet, almost polite, but they landed like a verdict as the security guard's arm blocked Maya Johnson at the gates of the estate, his eyes flicking over her simple coat, her worn shoes, the way her hands instinctively tightened around the small strap of her bag, as if she already knew this moment would come, because it always did, because places like this, where the driveway stretched nearly half a mile, lined with glowing lanterns and polished black cars worth more than most people's homes, weren't built for women like her. And yet here she was, standing under a sky turning violet at exactly 6:42 p.m., heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, trying to steady her breath before she could even speak. "I was told to come through the front," she said, her voice calm but soft, trained from years of choosing peace over confrontation. But the guard didn't move, didn't even blink, just tilted his head slightly like he'd heard this excuse 100 times before. "Staff. Entrances around back," he repeated, already dismissing her, already deciding who she was without asking, without knowing. And for a second, just a second, Maya felt that familiar sting rise in her chest, that quiet question that never fully went away. How many times does a person have to prove they deserve to stand somewhere before the world believes them? But before she could turn, before she could swallow it down and walk away like she always did, a voice cut clean through the space between them, sharp, controlled, impossible to ignore. "She's with me." The guard straightened instantly, stepping aside as if the air itself had shifted, and Maya turned, her breath catching not because she didn't recognize him, but because she did, because everyone did. Ethan Cole, standing just a few feet behind her in a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence quiet but commanding, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, whose name alone opened doors that stayed locked for everyone else. And yet his eyes, when they met hers, weren't cold, weren't dismissive, just steady, like he had already made a decision and wasn't interested in explaining it to anyone. "You're late," he said, not harsh, not kind, just matter of fact, as if this night had already begun without her, as if she had already stepped into something bigger than she understood. And Maya swallowed, nodding once. "Traffic," she replied, though they both knew that wasn't the real reason, that the real reason was standing right there in front of her, the invisible line she had just crossed, the one that had almost turned her away. And for a moment, neither of them moved. The soft hum of distant music drifting from the mansion, the faint clink of glasses, laughter carried by the evening breeze, a world already celebrating something she hadn't been invited to understand, until Ethan stepped closer, just enough for his voice to lower, just enough for the moment to feel private despite the cameras flashing near the entrance. "Tonight," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "you're not staff." And there was a pause, not long, but long enough for her to feel the weight of what came next. "You're with me." The words should have felt simple, but they didn't. They settled somewhere deeper, somewhere uncertain, because Maya knew exactly what this was, knew it wasn't about her. Not really. That she had been chosen not because she belonged, but because she didn't, because she was the opposite of everything waiting inside those doors. And yet she lifted her chin slightly, a small, deliberate movement, the kind her mother used to remind her of when the world tried to make her feel small. "Stand straight. Don't shrink, not for anyone." And when Ethan offered his arm, she hesitated for half a heartbeat before taking it, her fingers light against his sleeve, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this wasn't just a gesture, it was a statement. And the moment they stepped forward together, everything shifted, the cameras turning, the whispers beginning before they even reached the entrance. Because people like Ethan Cole didn't arrive unnoticed, and they certainly didn't arrive with someone like her. And as the doors opened, warm golden lights spilling out across marble floors and crystal chandeliers that reflected a world built on wealth and expectation, Maya felt every eye land on her, measuring, questioning, judging, but she didn't look away, didn't lower her gaze, because somewhere between the gate and this moment, something inside her had changed, something quiet but unshakable. And as they walked into the room where Ethan's past was waiting at the altar, dressed in white and surrounded by people who believed they understood everything about him, Maya realized something they didn't, something no one in that room was prepared for. She wasn't here to be invisible, and whether they liked it or not, before this night was over, every single one of them would know her name. The moment they stepped deeper into the ballroom, the air shifted in a way that could not be explained, only felt, like a quiet ripple spreading across a still lake. Conversations softening, eyes turning, judgments forming in silence as crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over silk gowns and tailored suits that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. And Maya could feel it, the weight of every glance. The way people paused just long enough to notice her before pretending they had not. The subtle narrowing of eyes, the almost invisible tilt of heads, the question hanging unspoken in the room. Who is she and why is she here with him? And beside her, Ethan walked as if none of it existed, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, his hand steady at his side, not touching her, but close enough to signal something unmistakable, that she was not an accident, not a mistake, not someone to be brushed aside. And still, Maya knew this world operated on rules she had not written, rules that did not need to be spoken to be enforced. As a woman in a silver dress passed by just close enough for her perfume to linger and her voice to slip under the surface of politeness. Well, that is unexpected, followed by a soft laugh that carried more meaning than the words themselves, and Maya felt her fingers tighten slightly against her own palm before she forced them to relax, remembering the way her mother used to say, "They will always try to make you feel smaller. Do not help them do it." And so she lifted her chin just a fraction higher, her steps measured, controlled, refusing to rush, refusing to shrink, even as the whispers grew louder, weaving through the room like threads pulling tighter with every second, until a voice rose above the rest, smooth, confident, and edged with something sharper beneath. "Ethan." Charlotte Hayes stood near the center of the room, radiant in a gown that shimmered under the lights, every detail of her presence designed to command attention, and she did, effortlessly as. The room seemed to lean toward her without realizing it, her smile practiced, perfect, but her eyes, when they landed on Maya, flickered with something colder, something calculating. "You made it," she continued, stepping forward, her gaze briefly scanning Maya from head to toe in a way that felt more like evaluation than curiosity. "And you brought company." The pause was deliberate, just long enough to let the room fill in the blanks, just long enough for the word she chose not to say to echo louder than anything she could have spoken, and Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that only someone standing this close could notice. "Charlotte," he replied, his tone even, controlled, offering nothing more than her name. And for a moment, the tension hovered between them, past and present colliding in silence, until Charlotte let out a light laugh, raising her glass slightly as if to dissolve it. "Of course, I should be gracious. Tonight is about new beginnings." After all, her eyes returned to Maya, the smile never fading. "And who might you be?" The question sounded polite, but it carried expectation, a quiet demand to define, to categorize, to place her back into something familiar, something smaller, and Maya felt it. That moment where the world waited for her to either confirm what they believed or challenge it. And for a brief second, she thought of the back entrance, the path she had almost taken, the version of this night where she never stepped into this room at all. But that version no longer existed, not after the way she had walked through those doors, not after the way every eye had already marked her presence. And so instead of shrinking, instead of deflecting, she met Charlotte's gaze directly, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough confidence to cut through the noise without raising itself above it. "Maya," she said simply, offering nothing more, nothing less. And the simplicity of it seemed to unsettle something in the air, because it did not explain, did not apologize, did not justify. It simply existed, and for the first time, Charlotte's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second before returning, polished as ever. "Maya," she repeated, as if testing the name, as if deciding what to do with it, before turning slightly toward Ethan, her tone light, but her words deliberate. "You always did have a way of surprising people." And there it was, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the beginning of something beneath the surface, because this was no longer just about appearances, no longer just about a date brought to a wedding. It was about something deeper, something unresolved, something that had not stayed in the past the way it was supposed to. And as the music swelled gently in the background, as glasses clinked and conversations resumed in careful tones, Maya realized that this night was not going to be simple. Not for her, not for Ethan, not for anyone watching, because every step she took from here would either confirm everything they believed about her or challenge it in ways they were not ready to face. And somewhere across the room, a group of guests leaned closer together, their voices low but sharp with curiosity, already weaving their own version of the story. A story where she was temporary, where she was out of place, where she would eventually disappear as quietly as she had arrived. And Maya heard it, even without listening, felt it in the way the room held its breath just a little longer whenever she moved. And beside her, Ethan finally spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You do not have to prove anything to them. But there was something in the way he said it, something almost uncertain, as if he knew the words were not entirely true, as if he understood that sometimes the world demanded proof whether you offered it or not. And Maya did not look at him when she answered, her eyes still forward, still steady. I am not here for them, she said quietly. And for the first time since they had entered, something shifted in Ethan's expression, something small but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had always seemed unbreakable. Because whatever he had expected from this arrangement, whatever role he thought she would play, it was already beginning to change, and neither of them fully understood what that meant yet. The music swelled just slightly louder as the string quartet shifted into something softer, something elegant enough to mask the tension that had begun to settle beneath the surface of the room. And Maya could feel it now more clearly than before, the way conversations resumed, but never fully returned to normal. The way eyes still lingered a second too long before turning away, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, for her to slip, to confirm whatever quiet assumptions had already been made about her presence. And across the room, Charlotte moved with effortless precision, greeting guests, laughing lightly, every gesture polished, every word placed exactly where it needed to be. But every few moments, her gaze returned to Maya, not openly hostile, not obvious, just measured, controlled, like someone studying a variable that did not fit into her equation. And it was in one of those moments, when a server passed by with a tray of champagne, that Charlotte made her move. You must be enjoying yourself, she said, appearing beside Maya without warning, her tone warm enough to pass as kindness, but edged with something sharper beneath. It is not every day someone gets to experience a night like this. Maya turned slightly, accepting a glass from the tray more for something to hold than anything else, her fingers steady despite the way the room seemed to tighten around them. It is beautiful, she replied simply, her voice even, not rising to meet the implication, not shrinking from it either. And Charlotte smiled, tilting her head just enough to appear curious. I imagine it must be quite different from what you are used to. The words were gentle, almost sympathetic, but they carried weight, the kind that pressed quietly but firmly, inviting agreement, inviting Maya to place herself exactly where Charlotte believed she belonged. And for a moment, the world seemed to pause again, the space between them narrowing into something almost tangible, until Maya set her glass down carefully on the edge of a nearby table, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. Different does not always mean unfamiliar, she said, her gaze steady. And something in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because that was not the answer Charlotte had expected, not the answer anyone had expected. And Charlotte's smile held, but just barely, as if it had been tested and found slightly less secure than before. Of course, she replied, her voice light, though her eyes had cooled. Well, I hope you continue to enjoy the evening. And with that, she turned away, but not before casting one last glance toward Ethan. A glance that carried meaning Maya could not fully read yet, but felt nonetheless. And as Charlotte disappeared back into the center of the room, the whispers began again, quieter now, but more focused, more deliberate, as if the narrative was being rewritten in real time. Not just who is she, but what is she? And beside her, Ethan exhaled slowly, a sound so faint it might have gone unnoticed if she had not been standing this close. She does not like surprises, he said under his breath, not as an apology, not quite as a warning, but something in between. And Maya allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Neither do I," she replied. And for the first time that night, Ethan's expression shifted into something that almost resembled amusement, though it faded as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something more thoughtful, more aware, as if he was beginning to realize that whatever role he had asked her to play was no longer entirely under his control. And across the room, a man in a tailored navy suit approached, his posture confident, his smile practiced. "Ethan, good to see you," he said, extending a hand, which Ethan accepted with a nod. "It has been a while." The man's gaze flicked briefly toward Maya, curiosity flashing openly now. "And you brought someone interesting." There it was again, that word, interesting, stretched just enough to carry implication, to suggest novelty rather than belonging, and Maya felt it, the way the label hovered, waiting to be accepted or rejected. And this time, before Ethan could respond, before the moment could settle into something predictable, she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying just enough to redirect the space without overpowering it. "It is nice to meet you," she said, offering her hand with quiet confidence. "Maya Johnson." And the man hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, just long enough to reveal the surprise he had not intended to show. "Daniel Whitaker," he replied, his tone adjusting, recalibrating, as if the simple act of her introduction had shifted something in his perception, and Maya held his gaze just long enough to make it clear that she saw it, that she understood exactly what had just changed. And when he released her hand, the air felt different again, less certain, less easily defined, and as Daniel turned back to Ethan, launching into a conversation about business and markets and numbers that seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from the one Maya had come from, she allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to take in the room not as something she needed to survive, but as something she could navigate, because somewhere between the gate and this moment, she had stopped reacting to the space around her and started shaping it instead, and she could feel it now, the shift not just in how others saw her, but in how she stood within it. And yet, beneath that growing steadiness, there was still something else, something unresolved, something waiting, because this night was far from over, and if Charlotte's earlier glance meant anything, it was that whatever came next would not be subtle, and Maya knew, without needing to be told, that the real test had not even begun yet. The laughter near the center of the room grew louder, brighter, almost rehearsed, as if someone had just delivered the perfect line, and when Maya turned her head slightly, she saw Charlotte again, now surrounded by a circle of guests who leaned in just enough to signal importance, just enough to reinforce the invisible hierarchy that governed everything in that space. And then Charlotte's voice carried, not raised, not forced, but placed with precision so it reached exactly as far as she intended. "I think we should all take a moment," she said, lifting her glass lightly, the room responding almost instantly, conversations softening, attention shifting, because when someone like Charlotte spoke, people listened, and Maya felt it before she understood it, that subtle tightening in the air, the way Ethan's posture changed just slightly beside her, not tense, but alert, as if he recognized the shift as well. "Tonight is not just about celebration," Charlotte continued, her smile warm, gracious, every word wrapped in elegance. "It is about recognizing the journey that brought us here." And there was something in the way she said it, something layered beneath the surface, as if the words carried more than one meaning depending on who was listening. And then, slowly, deliberately, her gaze moved through the crowd until it landed on Maya again, holding just long enough to make the intention clear. "And sometimes," she added, her tone softening into something that sounded almost reflective, "that journey includes unexpected detours." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room, polite, restrained, but unmistakable, and Maya could feel the eyes returning to her again, sharper now, more focused, because this was no longer just curiosity, it was invitation to judge, to compare, to place her exactly where Charlotte wanted her to be, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how she would respond, whether she would shrink under the weight of it, or disappear into the background the way they expected her to. And beside her, Ethan's voice came low, steady. "You do not have to engage." But Maya did not look at him, did not move away, because something inside her had already decided, something quiet but firm, and as Charlotte lowered her glass, as the attention lingered just a second too long, Maya took a step forward, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to shift the balance of the moment. And the movement alone was enough to draw silence. Real silence this time, the kind that did not need to be enforced, because no one had expected it. No one had expected her to step into the center of a space that had never been designed for her. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, carrying without strain. "You are right," she said, her gaze meeting Charlotte's directly. "Journeys do take unexpected turns." And there was a pause, not empty, but deliberate, as if she was choosing each word with care, not for effect, but for truth. "But sometimes," she continued, her tone steady, "those turns reveal things people were not prepared to see." The room stilled completely now, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by something else, something quieter, more uncertain, and Charlotte's smile held, but her eyes sharpened, calculating, adjusting, because this was no longer unfolding the way she had intended, and Maya could feel it, that shift, that moment where the narrative slipped just slightly out of someone else's control, and she did not raise her voice, did not rush to fill the silence. She simply stood there, present, grounded, allowing the weight of her words to settle without forcing them. And across the room, a few guests exchanged glances, subtle but telling, as if they were reconsidering something they had already decided, and Ethan, beside her, did not interrupt, did not step in, because for the first time, he was not managing the moment. He was watching it unfold, watching her unfold, and Charlotte, after a brief pause that lasted just long enough to register, let out a soft laugh, lifting her glass again as if to reclaim the space. "Well," she said smoothly, "I suppose surprises do keep things interesting." Her tone light, controlled, but there was a flicker beneath it now, something less certain than before, and as the room slowly exhaled, as conversations began to resume in quieter tones, Maya stepped back to Ethan's side, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if nothing unusual had just occurred. But inside, something had shifted, not just in how she was seen, but in how she moved within that space. And Ethan turned his head slightly toward her, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "That was not part of the agreement," he said, not accusing, not disapproving, just stating a fact. And Maya allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile, not directed at him, not directed at anyone, just something that existed on its own. "Neither was this," she replied softly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the music rising again, the rhythm of the evening attempting to return to what it had been, but it could not fully, because something had already changed, something that could not be undone. And across the room, Charlotte lowered her glass, her gaze lingering once more, longer this time, more focused, as if she had made a decision, as if whatever came next would not be delivered through subtle comments or polite laughter, but something more direct, something more decisive, and Maya felt it, that quiet certainty settling in her chest, because she understood now that this night was not just about surviving someone else's world, it was about confronting it, and the real confrontation was still coming. The music shifted again, slower now, more deliberate, as if the night itself was preparing for something heavier, something that could not be softened by elegance or drowned in polite conversation. And Maya felt it before she saw it, that subtle pull in the room, the way attention began to gather toward the front where a stage had been set, not large, not dramatic, but elevated just enough to separate those who spoke from those who listened. And beside her, Ethan straightened slightly, his expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd and everything to do with anticipation, because he knew what was coming, even if Maya did not. "It is time," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. And then Charlotte stepped forward once more, the room responding instantly, glasses lowering, voices fading, every movement aligning with hers as if she had rehearsed not just the event, but the people within it. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice warm, composed, carrying effortlessly through the space. "This evening means more to me than I can fully express." And as she spoke, Maya watched, not with admiration, not with resentment, but with clarity, because there was something beneath the surface of Charlotte's words now, something that no longer felt like celebration alone. And then Charlotte paused, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling, once again, on Maya. And I believe, she continued, her tone shifting ever so slightly, becoming more reflective, more intentional, that moments like this are also an opportunity to acknowledge truth. The word landed differently, heavier than the rest, and a quiet murmur passed through the guests, subtle but present, as if they sensed the change even if they could not yet define it. Because appearances, Charlotte said, her smile softening into something almost sympathetic, can be misleading. And there it was, the shift made visible, the line crossed from implication into intention, and Maya felt the air tighten around her, not suffocating, but focused, as if the entire room had narrowed into a single point where she stood. And for a brief moment, she thought of stepping back, of letting the moment pass, of choosing silence the way she had so many times before. But something inside her held steady, something that refused to retreat, and beside her, Ethan's voice came low, controlled. Do not respond. But there was tension in it now, not authority, not certainty, something closer to conflict, and Maya did not answer him, because her attention was already fixed on Charlotte, already anchored in what was unfolding. I believe, Charlotte continued, her gaze unwavering, that everyone deserves to know exactly who is standing in front of them. And with that, she turned slightly, gesturing toward Maya with a movement so graceful it almost disguised the intention behind it. So perhaps, she said lightly, we should not pretend tonight. The words were gentle, but they carried weight, and the silence that followed was no longer polite. It was expectant, charged, waiting, and Maya could feel it in the way every eye settled fully on her now. No longer glancing, no longer questioning quietly, but watching openly, directly, as if the answer to something important was about to be revealed. And for the first time that night, the pressure was not just external. It pressed inward as well, testing, asking, demanding something from her. And in that moment, she realized something simple and undeniable, that whatever happened next would define not just how they saw her, but how she saw herself in this space. And Charlotte's voice softened again, almost kind. Maya, she said, using her name now with careful precision. Would you like to tell them? And there was no anger in it, no raised voice, just invitation, but it was not an invitation to speak freely. It was an invitation to confirm what had already been decided, to step into the role that had been assigned to her without her consent. And the room held still, waiting, and Maya felt the silence stretch, felt the weight of expectation pressing against her chest. And for a fraction of a second, she considered it, considered saying nothing, letting the assumption stand, walking away from a moment that had not been built for her in the first place. But then she remembered the gate, the hand that had stopped her, the words "you do not belong here," and something in her settled, something quiet but unshakable. And when she stepped forward, it was not fast, not dramatic, just enough to claim the space that had been denied to her before. And her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, carrying without force. I clean his house, she said, the truth simple, unembellished, and a ripple moved through the room, not loud, but unmistakable, confirmation spreading like a current, because now it was spoken. Now it was real in a way that could not be ignored. And Charlotte's smile returned, brighter now, more secure, as if the narrative had snapped back into place. Thank you for your honesty, she said smoothly, turning slightly toward the guests. I think transparency is always important. And a few soft laughs followed, restrained but present, the kind that signaled alignment rather than amusement. And beside her, Ethan's posture stiffened, his silence heavier now, not neutral, not detached, something closer to realization. And Maya stood there, not shrinking, not apologizing, simply existing in the truth she had spoken. And for a moment, it seemed as if that would be the end of it, that the room would settle back into its expectations, that the roles would remain intact. But then Maya inhaled slowly, her gaze lifting once more, not toward Charlotte this time, but toward the room itself, toward the people who had already decided what her truth meant. And her voice followed, just as steady as before. But that is not the only thing I do, she added. And this time, the silence that fell was different, deeper, because the story they thought they understood had just begun to shift again. The silence that followed did not break immediately. It stretched, deepened, like the entire room had leaned forward at once without realizing it. Because what Maya had just said did not fit into the version of her they had already accepted, and Charlotte's smile held for a moment longer than it should have, just long enough to reveal the smallest flicker of uncertainty beneath it. "Oh," she said lightly, her tone still composed but thinner now, as if she was adjusting in real time. "And what else do you do?" The question sounded casual, almost curious, but it carried expectation, an assumption that whatever came next would be small, harmless, something that could be easily folded back into the narrative she had already built, and Maya felt it. The way the room waited again. But this time it was different, not just waiting for confirmation, but for contradiction, and she did not rush to answer, did not fill the space too quickly, because she understood something now that she had not. When she first walked through those doors, that silence, when held with intention, could be just as powerful as words, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, steady, unchanged. "I design community housing programs," she said, and for a second, nothing happened, the words hanging in the air as if the room needed time to process them, to decide whether they had heard correctly, and then a soft murmur moved through the guests, not loud, but undeniable, confusion mixing with curiosity, because that was not what they had expected, not what they had prepared for. And Charlotte's expression shifted again, subtle but visible now, her smile tightening just slightly as she let out a quiet laugh. "That is admirable," she said, her tone carefully neutral. But there was something beneath it now, something that did not quite align with the word she had chosen. A wonderful hobby. And there it was, the attempt to minimize, to reposition, to bring the statement back down into something safe, something that did not challenge the structure of the room. And, for the first time, Ethan moved, just slightly, his gaze turning toward Maya not with control, not with expectation, but with something closer to curiosity, as if he was hearing this part of her for the first time as well, and Maya caught it, that shift, that moment where the dynamic between them changed again, and she allowed herself a small breath before continuing, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "It is not a hobby," she said, her eyes returning to Charlotte, steady, unwavering. "It is the project your foundation is funding tonight." And the effect was immediate, not explosive, not loud, but sharp, like a sudden drop in temperature that everyone could feel at once. Conversation stopped entirely now, no longer pretending to continue, no longer masking anything. Because something real had just entered the room, something that could not be dismissed with a polite smile or a carefully chosen word. And Charlotte did not respond right away, her expression still composed but her eyes shifting just slightly, calculating, reassessing, because this was no longer a situation she controlled entirely, and Maya took a step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance that had always existed between them. "The pilot program in South Chicago," she continued, her voice steady, precise, "the one that reduces housing costs by 30% and creates local jobs." A few heads turned now, recognition flickering across faces that had read the reports, that had praised the initiative without ever questioning where it came from, and Maya's gaze moved briefly through the room before returning to Charlotte. "That was my work," she said simply, and this time, the silence that followed was absolute. No murmurs, no whispers, just stillness, because the narrative had not just shifted, it had broken, and in that break, something else had emerged, something undeniable, and beside her. Ethan exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more meaning than any words he could have spoken, because whatever he had expected from this night, whatever role he thought Maya would play, it had already been rewritten, and Charlotte finally spoke, her voice still controlled but no longer effortless. "That is a bold claim," she said, her tone measured, but there was tension in it now, visible in the way her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. And Maya did not react to the challenge, did not defend, did not escalate. She simply met it with the same steady presence she had held all night. "It is not a claim," she replied quietly. "It is documented." And the word landed with weight, not because it was loud, but because it was certain, and across the room, Daniel Whitaker shifted slightly, his expression no longer casual, no longer amused, but focused, as if he was recalculating something important, and one by one. The guests who had once watched Maya with quiet judgment now looked at her differently, not fully convinced, not fully understanding, but no longer dismissing her either. And in that shift, subtle as it was, something fundamental had changed, because for the first time that night, Maya was no longer being defined by the space around her. She was defining it herself. And Charlotte, standing at the center of it all, understood that the balance she had controlled so carefully was no longer stable. And the look she gave Maya now was no longer polite, no longer measured. It was focused, direct, as if she had decided that subtlety was no longer enough. And whatever came next would not be hidden beneath soft words or practiced smiles. It would be something else entirely. The air in the room did not just shift, it fractured. The kind of quiet fracture that does not make a sound but changes everything. Because now people were not just watching Maya, they were reevaluating her. And that was far more dangerous than simple judgment. Because judgment could be ignored, but reevaluation meant the foundation of their assumptions had already begun to crack, and Charlotte felt it too. That subtle loss of control, the way the room was no longer fully aligned with her. And for a moment, just a moment, something sharper surfaced in her expression before it smoothed back into place. But this time the polish felt thinner, more deliberate. "Well," she said slowly, her voice still composed but no longer effortless. "If that is true, then I am sure there must be evidence." The word landed carefully, not as a question, not as curiosity, but as a challenge, an invitation to prove, because in her world, claims without validation were meaningless. And more importantly, this was her ground, her event, her stage, and she intended to take it back. And a few guests shifted slightly, the energy tilting again, not fully back in Charlotte's favor, but uncertain now, waiting to see if Maya could sustain what she had started or if it would collapse under scrutiny. And Maya felt it, that pressure returning, sharper this time, more focused, because this was no longer about presence, it was about proof. And for a brief second, she did not move, did not answer, not because she did not have one, but because she understood the weight of the moment, understood that how she responded would define everything that followed. And beside her, Ethan's voice came low, controlled, but carrying something new, something closer to concern. "You do not have to do this," he said. And this time, there was no authority in it, no attempt to guide the situation, just a quiet recognition that this had gone beyond what either of them had planned. And Maya turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze for the first time since she stepped forward. And what he saw there was not hesitation, not fear, but clarity, the kind that does not ask permission. And when she looked back toward Charlotte, her expression had not hardened, had not sharpened, it had simply settled, as if she had arrived at a place she could not be moved from. "There is," she said calmly, and without rushing, without dramatics. She reached into her bag, the same simple bag that had been silently judged when she first arrived, and for a moment, the movement itself held the room, every eye following it, because no one had expected this, no one had expected her to come prepared. And when she pulled out a thin folder, worn at the edges but carefully kept, something about it felt different from everything else in the room, not polished, not decorative, but real. And she stepped closer to the stage, not waiting for permission, not asking for space, just taking it, and placed the folder gently on the small podium beside Charlotte, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if each one carried meaning beyond itself. "The initial proposal," she said, opening it just enough to reveal the documents inside, "submitted 18 months ago." A few people leaned forward now, not openly, but enough to signal attention, real attention, and Maya did not look at them, did not seek validation from the room. She kept her focus steady, anchored. "The implementation plan," she continued, turning a page with care, "and the impact report from the first 6 months." And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, because now this was no longer about belief or doubt. It was about evidence, and Charlotte's hand tightened slightly around her glass before she set it down, her gaze dropping briefly to the documents, scanning, calculating. And for the first time that night, there was no immediate response, no quick redirection. Because this was not something that could be dismissed with a smile or reframed with a sentence. And across the room, Daniel Whitaker took a step closer, his expression focused, no longer casual, no longer detached, and Ethan watched, not stepping in, not intervening, because he understood now that this moment did not belong to him, that whatever was unfolding had moved beyond his control entirely, and Maya stood there, not speaking, not filling the silence, because she knew something Charlotte did not, that the truth, when placed clearly enough, did not need to be defended. And finally, Charlotte lifted her gaze again, her composure still intact but altered, her voice measured in a way it had not been before. "That is impressive," she said, and this time, the word carried less certainty, less ownership, as if it no longer fully belonged to her. And Maya did not respond to the compliment, did not acknowledge it, because that was not what this was about, and the room felt it, that shift, that quiet but undeniable transfer of weight from one side to the other, not complete, not finished, but real. And in that moment, something else surfaced, something deeper than status or perception, something closer to truth, because for the first time that night, Maya was not being evaluated by where she stood, but by what she had done, and Charlotte, standing at the center of it all, understood that this was no longer a situation she could control with subtlety or suggestion, and the look she gave Maya now was different, no longer polite, no longer distant, but direct, focused, as if she had made a decision, and whatever came next would not be quiet, would not be hidden, it would be something that demanded a response, something that would force the night to reveal exactly what it was made of. The silence did not break the way it usually did. There was no immediate laughter to smooth it over, no polite shift back into celebration. Instead it deepened, stretched across the room, like something heavy and undeniable, because now the truth was no longer abstract. It was sitting right there on the podium in black and white, and Charlotte could feel it slipping. The control she had held so carefully throughout the evening beginning to fracture in ways she could not easily repair, and when she lifted her chin again, her smile returned, but it was no longer effortless, it was intentional, constructed. "Documentation can be misleading," she said calmly, her voice steady but carrying a sharper edge now, especially when multiple contributors are involved. And there it was, the pivot, the attempt to reclaim authority not by denying Maya completely, but by diluting her, by turning her contribution into something shared, something less singular, less powerful, and a few guests nodded. Slightly, the uncertainty in the room shifting again, searching for something stable to hold on to, because complexity was easier to accept than contradiction, and Maya saw it, felt it in the subtle change of posture around her, the way doubt tried to find its way back in, not fully, but enough to weaken what had just been established, and for a moment, she said nothing, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, because she understood what Charlotte was doing, understood that this was no longer about truth. It was about narrative control, and then she reached into the folder again, not hurried, not defensive, just precise, and pulled out a single sheet, placing it gently on top of the others. "This is the original submission email," she said, her voice calm, "with my name, my credentials, and the timestamp." And the effect was immediate, not loud, but sharp, like a line being drawn clearly where before there had only been suggestion, and Daniel stepped closer now. No hesitation this time, his hand hovering just briefly before picking up the page, scanning it quickly, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. And when he looked up, it was no longer at Charlotte, it was at Maya. "This is valid," he said, his voice carrying enough to reach the front of the room, not loud, but authoritative, and that was all it took. Because Daniel Whitaker was not someone whose words were questioned lightly in a room like this, and the ripple that followed was stronger now, not confusion, but recalibration, the kind that happens when something undeniable forces a shift, and Charlotte's fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the podium before she released it, her composure still intact, but thinner now, more fragile, and for the first time that night, she did not respond immediately, because there was no easy redirection left, no subtle comment that could dissolve what had just been confirmed, and Maya stood there, not triumphant, not defiant, just steady, grounded in something that did not depend on the room's approval, and beside her, Ethan watched in silence. But this time his expression had changed completely, the distance gone, replaced by something else, something closer to realization, as if he was seeing her not as the role he had assigned, but as something far more complex, far more real. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, but clear enough to be heard. You never told me. And it was not an accusation, not frustration, just truth. And Maya turned slightly toward him, her gaze calm. You never asked, she replied, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else had that night, because it exposed something deeper, something that went beyond Charlotte, beyond the room, beyond the performance they had both stepped into. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, before he looked back toward the front, toward Charlotte, whose composure had returned. Just enough for her to speak again, though her voice was different now, still controlled, but no longer entirely certain. Well, she said, lifting her chin slightly. It seems we have all learned something unexpected tonight. And the words were meant to reclaim the narrative, to frame the moment as discovery rather than exposure. But the room no longer responded the same way. The energy had shifted too far, too clearly, and Maya could feel it. The difference in how people looked at her now, not fully understanding, not fully aligned, but no longer dismissive, no longer certain of their earlier assumptions. And in that space, that fragile, shifting space, something else began to form, something quieter but more powerful, because this was no longer just about proving a point. It was about changing the way the room itself functioned, and Charlotte knew it. The way her eyes settled on Maya now, no longer polished, no longer distant, but direct, sharp, as if she had reached the limit of subtlety and was preparing for something else entirely, something that would not rely on implication or suggestion, but confrontation. And Maya felt it, that shift, that escalation, and she did not move, did not step back, because whatever came next, she was no longer the person who had been stopped at the gate. She was already standing inside, already part of the space whether they accepted it or not, and the night, far from settling, was only just beginning to reveal what it truly was. The room did not return to celebration. It hovered in something else now, something unsettled, as if the script everyone had silently agreed to follow had been rewritten without warning, and Maya could feel it in the way conversations no longer flowed naturally. In the way people watched her not with curiosity anymore, but with caution, because now she was not just unexpected, she was disruptive, and that was far more difficult to ignore. And at the center of it all, Charlotte stood still for a moment longer than necessary, her posture perfect, her expression composed, but something behind it had shifted, something sharper, more deliberate, as if she had reached a point where subtlety was no longer useful. And when she spoke again, her voice was calm, but the softness from earlier had disappeared entirely. It is impressive, she said slowly, her gaze fixed on Maya, how easily a narrative can be shaped when the audience only sees part of the story. And a quiet tension moved through the room, because this was no longer veiled, no longer polite. It was direct, controlled, and intentional, and Maya did not move, did not react outwardly, but she felt it, the shift from challenge to confrontation. And Charlotte stepped slightly forward, closing the space just enough to make the moment feel more personal despite the audience surrounding them. You are clearly talented, she continued, her tone measured, but talent does not always translate to ownership. And there it was, the new angle, not denial, not dismissal, but repositioning, reframing Maya's work as something that could exist without belonging to her. Something that could be absorbed into a larger structure controlled by someone else. And a few guests nodded subtly, the logic familiar, comfortable, because it aligned with a system they understood, a system where ideas moved upward and credit followed power. And Maya saw it. The way the room tried to stabilize itself again, to return to something predictable, and for a brief second, the weight of it pressed against her, not enough to break her, but enough to remind her exactly what she was standing against. And beside her, Ethan's voice came low, firmer now. Charlotte, he said, not loud, but enough to signal a boundary, but Charlotte did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption, because this was no longer about him. Not really. This was about control, about ownership, about who had the right to define the narrative in a room like this. And Maya understood that now more clearly than ever. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained steady, grounded in something that did not depend on approval. Ownership is not defined by who speaks the loudest, she said calmly, her eyes meeting Charlotte's directly. It is defined by who did the work, and the words landed differently this time, not as a statement to be debated, but as a line drawn clearly, and the room felt it. The shift, the moment where the conversation moved beyond interpretation into something more concrete, and Charlotte's expression tightened, just slightly, before smoothing again. But this time the effort was visible, and for the first time, she glanced briefly toward the guests, as if measuring their reaction, as if recalculating the balance she had always controlled so easily. And that was when Daniel stepped forward again, not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to enter the space between them, his presence carrying its own authority. The Foundation's board reviewed this project last year, he said, his tone even, factual. The lead designer was listed as Maya Johnson, and the confirmation settled into the room like something final, something that could not be undone with interpretation or suggestion. And this time, the reaction was different, not murmurs, not whispers, but a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that shifts perception permanently, and Maya felt it, not as victory, not as triumph, but as something steadier, something more grounded, because this was never about proving herself to them. It was about refusing to be defined by what they assumed. And beside her, Ethan's silence carried more weight than any words he could have spoken, because now he was no longer observing from a distance. He was part of the shift, part of the moment that was unfolding beyond his control, and Charlotte stood still, her composure intact but altered, her gaze no longer dismissive, no longer distant, but focused, sharp, as if she had reached the point where the room itself was no longer enough to contain what she needed to say next. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, but far more direct. Then perhaps, she said. Her eyes locked on Maya. We should also be honest about how that opportunity came to exist in the first place. And the words hung there, heavy, deliberate, signaling something new, something deeper, because this was no longer about the present. It was about the past, about origins, about the structures that had allowed one story to rise and another to remain unseen. And Maya felt it immediately, the shift in direction, the way the conversation was about to move into territory that was more complex, more personal, more dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was layered. And for the first time that night, the room did not just watch, it leaned in, fully, completely, because whatever came next was no longer just about who Maya was. It was about everything that had been hidden beneath the surface all along, and the truth, once it begins to unfold, does not stop easily. The room leaned into the moment as if it had been waiting for it all along, the kind of silence that does not just listen but anticipates, because Charlotte's words had shifted something deeper, something no longer contained within polite boundaries, and Maya felt it instantly, the change in direction, the way this was no longer about what she had done, but how she had been allowed to do it. And Charlotte took a slow step forward, her gaze unwavering, her voice quieter now, but far more precise. Opportunities like that do not appear out of nowhere, she said, her tone measured, controlled. They come from connections, from access, from being in the right place at the right time. And a few heads nodded subtly, not in agreement with her specifically, but with the familiarity of the logic, because this was a language they understood, a system they recognized. And Charlotte's eyes remained fixed on Maya, and from what I understand, she continued, her voice softening just enough to make the words sound almost reflective. You were working in Ethan's home when this proposal was submitted. And there it was, the line drawn clearly, the implication no longer hidden, and the room responded not with sound, but with attention, sharper now, more focused, because this was no longer about talent or contribution, it was about legitimacy, about whether Maya's work existed independently or as a byproduct of proximity to power. And beside her, Ethan's posture shifted again, this time more visibly, his expression tightening as if he had stepped into something he had not anticipated. That is enough, he said, his voice firm, cutting through the space. But Charlotte did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption, because this was not a conversation she intended to share, and Maya stood still, feeling the weight of it, the way the room waited again, but this time with a different kind of expectation, one that questioned not just her place in the room, but the origin of her presence entirely. And for a moment, she said nothing, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood what this moment represented, that this was not just about defending herself. It was about confronting something larger, something that had always existed beneath the surface. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, unchanged. "Yes," she said simply, and the admission moved through the room like a quiet current, because it confirmed part of Charlotte's narrative, and for a second, it seemed as if the balance might tilt again, as if the room was ready to settle back into something familiar, something that made sense within the structure they understood, and Charlotte's smile returned, more secure now, more certain. "Then I think we all understand," she said lightly, as if the conclusion had already been reached, as if the story had resolved itself exactly the way it was supposed to, and a few soft murmurs followed, not loud, not explicit, but enough to signal alignment, enough to suggest that the narrative was closing, that Maya's presence had been explained, contained, defined, and beside her, Ethan's silence grew heavier, not neutral, not distant, but conflicted, as if he was caught between what he knew and what the room was beginning to believe, and Maya felt it, that shift, that attempt to reduce her again, to fold her back into something smaller, something dependent, and for a brief second, the weight of it pressed against her chest, not enough to break her, but enough to remind her exactly what she was standing against, and then she exhaled slowly, grounding herself in something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the room, nothing to do with Charlotte, nothing to do with Ethan, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty, but there was something new in it now, something firmer, something that did not ask to be understood. "I was working in his home," she said, her gaze steady, "because I needed to pay my bills," and the simplicity of it cut through the assumptions more cleanly than any argument could have, because it did not deny the reality, it did not avoid it, it owned it, completely, and the room stilled again, not because the words were unexpected, but because of how they were delivered, without shame, without apology, without explanation beyond what was true, and Maya continued, her voice steady. "And I was working on that project at night," she added, her eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to Charlotte, "because no one was offering me an office to do it during the day." And the words landed differently now, not as defense, not as justification, but as reality, the kind that does not bend to fit into someone else's narrative, and something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Because this was no longer about proximity to power, it was about persistence despite the lack of it. And Charlotte's expression tightened just slightly, the certainty from moments before slipping just enough to reveal the effort beneath it. And for the first time, she did not respond immediately, because there was no easy way to reshape this, no simple way to turn it back into something smaller. And beside her, Ethan's voice came again, quieter now, but carrying something different, something closer to respect. "You built it anyway," he said, not as a question, but as realization, and Maya did not look at him when she answered, her focus still forward, still steady. "I built it because it needed to exist," she replied, and the words settled into the room like something final, something that did not require validation to be true, and the silence that followed was not uncertain this time. It was reflective, because the narrative had not just been challenged, it had been redefined, and for the first time that night, the room was no longer deciding who Maya was, it was beginning to understand it, and Charlotte, standing at the center of it all, felt it, the shift she could no longer fully control, and the look in her eyes now was different, not dismissive, not even confrontational, but calculating in a deeper way, as if she had reached the point where the only thing left was to decide how far she was willing to go to take it back, and whatever she chose next would not just shape the night, it would reveal exactly who she was beneath everything else. The silence that followed Maya's words did not feel fragile anymore. It felt anchored, like something solid had finally settled into the room and could not be easily moved. And for the first time that night, people were not shifting uncomfortably or searching for cues on how to respond. They were simply listening, processing, recalibrating everything they thought they understood, and at the center of it all, Charlotte stood still, her posture still perfect, her expression still composed, but The effort behind it was no longer invisible. It was present in the slight tension along her jaw, in the way her fingers rested a little too firmly against the edge of the podium. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but there was a new edge beneath it, something less polished, more personal. "That is a compelling story," she said slowly, her gaze fixed on Maya. "But stories are not what build institutions." And the words landed with intention, not as dismissal, but as repositioning, as if she was attempting one final time to shift the conversation away from Maya's lived reality and back into the language of power, structure, and authority. And a few guests straightened slightly, the familiarity of that framework offering something stable to hold on to, because institutions were their world, their measure of legitimacy. And Charlotte took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to reclaim the center of the space. "Foundations like mine," she continued, her voice gaining strength again, "require more than ideas. They require resources, networks, the ability to execute at scale." And there it was, the final argument. Not that Maya's work did not exist, but that it could not exist meaningfully without the system Charlotte represented. And for a moment, the room held that idea, tested it, because it made sense within the world they knew. And beside her, Ethan's expression shifted again, not in disagreement, not in agreement, but in recognition, because he understood that this was no longer about a single project. It was about two fundamentally different ways of defining value, and Maya felt it too. That shift into something deeper, something that was no longer about defending her place, but defining it on her own terms. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained steady, grounded in something that did not need to compete. "You are right," she said calmly, and the agreement itself caused a ripple of surprise, because it was not expected, not after everything that had been said. And Charlotte's expression flickered. For a fraction of a second, as if she had anticipated resistance, not alignment. And Maya continued, her gaze steady. "Institutions require resources," she said, her tone even. "But they also require purpose." And the words settled into the space differently, not as an abstract concept, but as something tangible, something that could not be measured in the same way as money or influence. And Maya took a small step forward, not to challenge, not to confront, but to stand fully in the space she had already claimed. "What I built started with people who were invisible to systems like yours," she continued, her voice calm but clear. "Families who were not being reached, communities that were not being seen." And the room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the conversation had moved beyond frameworks and into something more human, something more difficult to dismiss. And Maya's eyes moved briefly across the guests, not seeking approval, but acknowledging their presence. "The resources came later," she said, "but the purpose was there from the beginning." And the simplicity of it cut through the complexity Charlotte had introduced, because it reframed the entire conversation, not as a question of who enabled what, but as a question of what existed first, and why. And Charlotte stood still, her composure intact but altered, because this was no longer a space she could dominate with logic alone. And for the first time, she did not immediately respond, because the argument she had prepared did not fully apply anymore. And beside Maya, Ethan stepped forward, just slightly, not to take control, not to speak over her, but to stand with her, his presence no longer distant, no longer detached. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a clarity that had not been there before. "The foundation funded the expansion," he said, his gaze moving between Charlotte and the room. "But the model did not come from us." And the acknowledgement settled into the space with weight, because it came from someone who understood exactly what those words meant, someone who had been part of the system Charlotte represented, and the effect was immediate, not loud, but undeniable, because it confirmed what Maya had already established, not as an outsider's claim, but as something recognized from within. And Charlotte's expression tightened just slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in realization, because the balance had shifted in a way that could not be easily reversed, and the room felt it, the subtle but permanent change in how the story was being understood. And Maya stood there, not triumphant, not defiant, simply present, grounded in something that no longer needed to be proven. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue in the same way. The lines had been drawn, the truths had been placed clearly, and the only thing that remained was what each person chose to do with them. And Charlotte finally exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering on Maya, not with dismissal, not with challenge, but with something more complex, something that suggested she was seeing her not just as a disruption, but as something she had not accounted for. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more measured. "Then perhaps," she said, "the real question is not who created it." And the room leaned in once more, because whatever came next would not just respond to what had been said, it would redefine it entirely. But who it belongs to now. And the words settled into the space like something unresolved, something that did not close the conversation, but opened it in a way that was far more complicated than before. The question did not land like a conclusion. It opened something wider, deeper, something that could not be answered with a single word or claimed with a simple gesture. And the room felt it immediately. The shift from conflict into something more complex, more revealing. Because now this was no longer about proving who had done the work. It was about ownership, about power, about who had the right to define what came next. And Maya stood still for a moment, letting the weight of Charlotte's words settle, not rushing to respond, not reacting, because she understood that this was the moment where everything could be reframed again if she allowed it. And around her, the guests leaned in, not physically, but in attention, fully present now, no longer distracted, no longer uncertain, because whatever answer came next would not just resolve the tension, it would define the outcome. And Charlotte's gaze remained fixed on her, steady, composed, but no longer untouched by what had unfolded. Because now there was something else there, something closer to recognition, even if it was not yet acceptance. And beside Maya, Ethan did not speak, did not intervene, because he understood that this moment did not belong to him, that whatever was about to be said had to come from her alone. And Maya inhaled slowly, grounding herself not in the room, not in the expectations surrounding her, but in something deeper, something that had carried her long before she ever stepped into this space. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, carrying without force. "It does not belong to me," she said, and the words moved through the room with quiet surprise, because they were not what anyone expected, not after everything she had just established, not after everything she had proven. And for a brief second, the room hesitated, unsure how to place that answer, and Charlotte's expression flickered again, just slightly, as if recalculating, as if trying to understand where this was going. And Maya continued, her gaze steady. "And it does not belong to you either," she added, and this time the shift was sharper, more immediate, because now the statement was not just unexpected, it was redefining the entire premise of the question. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was focused, waiting. And Maya took a small step forward, not to challenge, not to dominate, but to stand fully in the space that had been contested all night. "It belongs to the people it was built for," she said, her tone steady, grounded, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else, through the arguments, through the structures, through the assumptions that had framed the conversation until now, because it removed ownership from the individuals standing in the room and placed it where it had always been meant to go. And something shifted again, deeper this time, because this was not a point that could be argued in the same way. It was not about credit or recognition anymore. It was about purpose, about impact, about something that existed beyond the boundaries of the room itself. And Maya's eyes moved briefly across the guests, not seeking approval, not asking for agreement, but acknowledging the space they occupied together. "The foundation can support it," she continued. "Expand it, give it resources." And her gaze returned to Charlotte, steady, unwavering, "But it does not define it." And the words settled into the room like something final, something that did not need to be reinforced, because it carried its own weight. And for the first time that night, Charlotte did not respond immediately, not because she could not, but because the framework she had been operating within no longer fully applied. And the room felt it, the shift from control into something else, something less certain, more open. And beside Maya, Ethan's expression had changed completely now, no longer distant, no longer conflicted, but clear, as if he had arrived at an understanding he had not expected when the night began. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried enough to be heard. "She is right," he said, and the words did not come with hesitation, did not seek approval. They simply existed as acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement mattered in a room like this, not because it validated Maya, but because it signaled a shift within the system itself. And a few guests exchanged glances, subtle but meaningful, because they understood what that meant, understood that the narrative was no longer being dictated from a single point. And Charlotte exhaled slowly, her posture still composed, her presence still commanding, but altered, undeniably altered. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, more measured. "Then perhaps," she said, her gaze moving between Maya and Ethan, "this evening has revealed more than any of us anticipated." And there was no sharpness in it now, no edge, just recognition, even if it was incomplete, even if it was not fully accepted. And the room seemed to breathe again, not returning to what it had been, but settling into something new, something that had been reshaped by what had unfolded. And Maya stood there, not triumphant, not elevated, simply present, grounded in something that did not depend on where she stood or who stood beside her. And for a moment, everything held, the tension, the understanding, the shift that could not be undone. And in that stillness, something else emerged, something quieter, but just as significant, because this was no longer just about what had been revealed, it was about what would happen next. And the night, though it felt complete in one way, was not over yet. The music returned slowly, cautiously, like the room itself was testing whether it could move forward after everything that had just been said. And for a moment, it did not feel like a celebration anymore. It felt like a transition, like something had ended and something else had begun. And Maya stood where she was, no longer at the edge, no longer out of place, but fully within the space. Not because she had been invited, but because she had claimed it in a way no one could undo. And around her, people began to move again, not with the same certainty as before, but with awareness, with a subtle shift in how they looked at her, how they spoke near her, how they carried themselves in a room that had just revealed something about itself. And Charlotte stepped back from the podium, her posture still composed, her presence still commanding, but quieter now, not diminished, just changed, as if she was recalibrating not only the event but her place within it. And when she lifted her glass again, her voice carried across the room, not with dominance, but with acknowledgement. "To truth," she said, and the words were simple, but they held weight, not because they resolved anything, but because they recognized what had unfolded. And glasses lifted, not in loud agreement, not in forced celebration, but in something more reflective, more grounded. And for the first time that night, Maya allowed herself to breathe fully, not because the tension was gone, but because it no longer controlled her. And beside her, Ethan remained still for a moment before turning toward her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but open in a way that surprised even him. "I thought I understood this world," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not belong to the room, only to the space between them. "But I did not understand you." And there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to justify what had come before, just honesty. And Maya met his gaze, not with judgment, not with softness, but with clarity. "You saw what you expected to see," she replied, her tone calm, not accusing, just true. And Ethan nodded slightly, the acknowledgement settling into him in a way that could not be undone. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the conversation they had just stepped into was not one that could be resolved in a single exchange. And across the room, Daniel was speaking quietly with a small group, his tone serious, his gestures precise, already shifting the conversation toward something practical, something that would carry beyond the night itself. And that, more than anything, signaled what had truly changed, because this was no longer just a moment, it was a movement, something that would continue after the music stopped, after the lights dimmed, after the guests returned to their own worlds. And Maya felt it, not as pressure, not as responsibility, but as possibility, something that had been there all along but had never been fully recognized until now. And Ethan glanced toward the exit briefly before looking back at her. "You do not have to stay," he said, his voice softer now, not as instruction, not as suggestion, but as an offering. And Maya considered it, not because she felt unwelcome, but because she understood that staying or leaving now meant something different than it had before, and she shook her head slightly, a small, deliberate movement. "I am not here for them," she said, echoing her own words from earlier. But this time they carried a different meaning, not defiance, not resistance, but ownership, and Ethan's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that had not been there when the night began, and the music swelled again, fuller now, as if the room had finally accepted that it could not return to what it had been, that it could only move forward into what it had become. And Charlotte, standing at a distance now, watched them for a moment longer before turning away, not in defeat, not in retreat, but in recognition that the narrative she had controlled was no longer hers alone, and that realization did not break her. It changed her, in ways that would not be visible immediately, but would unfold over time, and Maya felt that too. The shift not just in the room, but in the people within it, including herself, because she was no longer standing in someone else's world trying to fit into it. She was standing in her own, bringing it with her wherever she went. And as the evening continued, as conversations resumed and laughter returned in a quieter, more thoughtful rhythm, something remained beneath it all, something that could not be undone. And as Maya turned slightly, preparing to step away from the center of the room, Ethan's voice came again, not loud, not urgent, but clear, "Maya," and she paused, just briefly, turning back toward him, and in that moment, there was no audience, no expectation, no performance, just two people standing in the aftermath of something that had changed them both. And whatever came next would not be written by the room, or by the past, but by what they chose to do with the truth they had uncovered, and the night, though it had reached its end, had only just begun to reveal what it meant.